With hostages still in Gaza and the war rapidly escalating in Lebanon, why is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actively considering firing his defense minister? Why have the two men had knockdown, drag-out shouting matches inside closed cabinet meetings over the right way to prosecute this war? I'll bring you the inside story in part 2 of my exclusive conversation with Trey Yingst, chief foreign correspondent for Fox News, ahead of the release of his must-read book, Black Saturday, tonight on the Rosenberg Report.
At first blush, it seems inconceivable that amidst the most brutal, painful, and deadly war that Israel has faced since the War of Independence in 1948, that the country's prime minister and defense minister have reportedly been engaged in a series of knockdown, drag-out screaming matches over how this war should be waged and how to get the hostages out of Gaza before it's too late. Unfortunately, it's all true. And tonight, we'll bring you the inside story. Good evening and welcome to the Rosenberg Report, the only prime-time news and analysis program that's produced by Israelis here in Israel, indeed here in Jerusalem, our holy capital, on any American television network. Tonight, I'm honored to bring you part 2 of my conversation with Trey Yingst, the chief foreign correspondent and Israel bureau chief for the Fox News channel. Remarkably, Trey is the only American journalist to write a book about what happened on October 7th and what's happened since. Black Saturday, which releases on October 1st, tells the fascinating first-hand account of what Trey saw on that dreadful day, when upwards of 6,000 demon-possessed Hamas terrorists invaded Israel, tortured, raped, and slaughtered 1,200 innocent Israeli men, women, and children, and took 255 Israelis and foreigners hostage, 101 of whom are still being held in Gaza to this day. Last week, in his first sit-down television interview about his forthcoming new book, Trey shared some of the most painful and poignant moments from that day, as well as how he's tried to process the horror of what he saw emotionally and spiritually. If you missed that, I encourage you to watch the full episode on our YouTube channel or at rosenbergreport.tv. But what makes Trey's book even more of a must-read is that he includes exclusive interviews that he's conducted not only with senior Hamas terrorists themselves, but with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gollant, a man who rarely talks to the press, a man whose differences with Prime Minister Netanyahu could not be more profound.
Black Saturday is unique in many ways, but the access for this book is really unprecedented.
And it's not just Gallant. You've also got senior Hamas leaders who are talking to you in a wide range of militants, terrorists, and Israelis.
Absolutely. And my approach to everyone involved in the book is I'm not here to tell you what to say. I'm not here to spin one way or the other. I want to hear from your perspective what happened on October 7th and also what has happened throughout this war. And so I spoke with Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gollant a number of times. We met in person in the Kiryat, Israel's version of the Pentagon, to discuss the war and also what October 7th was like for him. And I got new insight into the Israeli military on that morning, because as we know, there was a clear intelligence failure on the morning of October 7th to allow thousands of Hamas militants into Israel to conduct this massacre, targeting mostly the civilian population, along with all of the bases along the border. It was something that had to be planned in advance and something that was strategic from the perspective of Hamas, targeting the surveillance towers, the machine guns along the border, breaking through the barriers.
And taking over 250 hostages in order to have leverage against Israel and hope. And I think they thought that Israel wasn't going to go in as a result.
Exactly. One of the most interesting parts about Black Saturday is the coverage on the night of Israel's ground invasion into Gaza. It's late October. Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gollant is at the Kiryat, Israel's version of the Pentagon, and he is watching on screens as Israeli forces cross the border in a convoy kilometers long into Gaza. And he has a strategy that he had developed years before because he had run Southern Command. He had been in the Special Forces of the Navy, Shayetet 13. He's someone who had fought in Gaza before. And he had this idea of hitting Hamas hard on the outside because he knew they would be strong in a ring around places like Gaza City, but also specifically around neighborhoods in Gaza, like the Shati camp that sits along the Mediterranean Sea. Hit them hard there, penetrate the outer ring, and then the task would be much easier. And so this was part of his strategy, and he talks about this in our interviews. And there's one time, and I write a little bit about it, but I'm going to sort of set the scene for you about what this was like. As Gallant is telling me about the ground invasion and his strategy to take the battle to Hamas, he pulls out this map, this huge map, goes behind his desk, pulls out a big map and rolls it out on the table. And then he takes the coffee and tea that we're drinking at the time and he puts it at the edge of the map. And he starts to show me exactly how forces came in from the north. And what's so interesting for me is that at the time we are standing in Sderot on a hilltop watching this take place in the night.
Meaning he's telling you something that you are remembering because you were covering it that night.
Yeah, and he's providing more detail because we could hear the APCs moving on the road. We could see the massive air campaign that was basically laying the groundwork for the Israeli forces that were about to go in. But I had all these questions about what was actually happening behind the scenes. And Black Saturday takes the reader behind the scenes. And Gallant describes firsthand what his strategy was like and gives us the information for the night of the ground invasion. And it really illuminates what that strategy was like for the Israelis as they took the fight to Hamas on the ground. And I think that the night of the ground invasion is one of many moments in Black Saturday where you start to get into the mind of Yoav Gollant, Israel's defense minister, and how he wanted to conduct this war.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that Israel decided to take 3 weeks from October 7th, roughly 3 weeks, until they moved. Partly, of course, you've got to mobilize almost 400,000 civilians into their reserve units. You need to train them. You need to build plans. You need to arm them, and you need to move them to the front. True, but also it's an interesting period where Israel is now dropping millions of leaflets with maps telling people in northern Gaza, this is where you need to go to get out of harm's way. Millions of phone calls and text messages to people, to Palestinians saying, you need to get out of harm's way. We're coming. I don't know that I can think of a single example in military history where an army is planning to invade and yet is giving so much advance information. And they were doing it for humanitarian reasons. They knew they would be criticized for civilian casualties. Whether he talked about it or not, I don't know, maybe he did, but what's your assessment of how well Israel has handled this issue of moving into one of the most densely, if not the most densely packed civilian areas in the entire world?
So I haven't talked about this yet with anyone, but I cover it in Black Saturday. And I'll give you this piece of information from the book because it was quite interesting. As the war is unfolding and these warnings are being sent to civilians to evacuate, Hamas starts to block some of the civilians from leaving their homes after the Israelis have conducted what are called roof knock strikes, basically a warning for people to get out of the way because they're about to bomb. Now, they don't do this throughout the entire war, but at the beginning, they are notifying some civilians that they are about to strike. And Hamas, I'm told by a source, is blocking them. And so I check with another source on the ground inside Gaza to confirm that this is happening. And then I take that information to a senior Hamas official. And he tells me, Trey, this is impossible. And I say, sir, here's the evidence. It's not impossible. It's happening on the ground. And this gives you a sense of the real-time reporting that we are doing and that I chronicle in Black Saturday, because we are actually talking to the people who are responding to these orders from the Israeli military and then pressuring Hamas about allowing civilians to get out of the way. And this is really an interesting part of my job because I don't just pressure Hamas. I also pressure Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gollant and the Israeli military because, look, this is a war. And thousands of civilians have been killed in this war. I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist if I didn't talk about that. And so it's part of my role to ask Hamas why they're not allowing civilians to get out of the way when Israel warns them to leave. It's also part of my job as a journalist to put pressure on the Israeli military and ask them the tough questions about the rapidly rising civilian casualty rate inside Gaza. But I do both. And I think that is what sets Black Saturday apart and what sets our journalism on the ground apart from others.
Coming up next on the Rosenberg Report, why have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gollant had knockdown, drag-out shouting matches inside closed cabinet meetings over the right way to prosecute this war. Find out the inside story when the Rosenberg Report continues on TBN right after this break.
But first, I want to say that in Israel's darkest hour, a lot of people are asking me, how can we help? How can we support Israel in its time of greatest need and be part of that biblical mandate found in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God is speaking of blessing those who bless the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, a great way to do it is to partner with our sponsor of today's edition of the Rosenberg Report, Artza. Go to artzabox.com. Use the discount promo code RR15, Rosenberg Report 15, to get a 15% discount off the price of your Artza box. They are literally a taste of the Holy Land, and they come directly to your home in a beautiful box that contains potpourri, a range of all kinds of products made in Israel by all kinds of Israeli artisans, entrepreneurs, and small business owners. You're going to love them for yourself, for your family, and they make great gifts as well. Check it out. Go to artzabox.com, use the discount code RR15, Rosenberg Report 15, and I have no doubt that you'll love these boxes, these Artza boxes, as much as Lynn and I do. Okay, one of the things I find super fascinating in your book and as in life as it's playing out is the battle between Prime Minister Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gollant. Netanyahu has had such intense clashes with Gallant and vice versa. Even before this war, during the judicial reform last year, Netanyahu very publicly fired Gallant because Gallant was warning in the spring of 23, this whole judicial reform debate is so intense, it's dividing the society so much, it could cause our enemies to think that we're weak and divided, and it could cause an attack. And Netanyahu fired him over that, and then got such pressure from the public that he sort of rescinded the firing. Gallant wasn't wrong, but that was the first clash. Then we've had two other big ones, so let's deal with them. The current clash that they're having is Gallant has argued throughout this war, we got to keep, or since the November ceasefire, we need to keep putting so much military pressure on Hamas. That's the way to get the hostages out. If they feel like they're losing, if they're under siege, they're more likely to give up the hostages. But now, at the moment where Gallant says, okay, we've put that pressure on, it's time now to cut a deal and get these hostages back, Netanyahu saying, no, we always have to hold on to the Philadelphia corridor, and he's got a number of other requirements that the deal would have. And Gallant is saying, no, this is the moment. Make the deal. Don't put new demands on the table. How do you assess these two? Some of these things, these tensions were happening while you were reporting the book. Some of these things have been happening more recently, but it's critical. This is not Netanyahu versus his left-wing critics, of which he has, buku many. This is two Likudniks. These are two people from the same political party. What's going on between these two men?
Absolutely, and I'll give you a little bit of background on the reporting for this book because I think it's quite interesting, and I haven't talked about this either, but I put in interview requests formally for this book with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gollant. Netanyahu's people tried to push me off to advisors and said, you can interview them first and we'll think about the Prime Minister later. Gallant had been willing to speak from the beginning of the war.
It's amazing.
And it's important for me as a journalist to be on the record saying that. Yeah. I always give everyone an opportunity to speak. Look, right now there is a massive clash unfolding between Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gollant. He fired Gallant previously. There's been ongoing tension between the pair. They're from the same party, the Likud party of Israel, but they have a different vision for the end of this war, and especially a different vision for the possibility of a long-term ceasefire agreement that would allow for the release of Israeli hostages exchanged for Palestinian prisoners, and a temporary ceasefire for Gaza. Because both leaders do agree on the idea that once that ceasefire is done, they would go back and continue operations against Hamas. When I look at the two of them side by side, Israel's prime minister certainly makes decisions in a way that are on a different plane than Gallant, because he considers politics a lot more than Gallant. Gallant, at least from my reporting, doesn't really want to be prime minister in the future. He doesn't have a lot of political aspirations after this. Based on my conversations with Gallant, Defense Minister of Israel is the highest position he will serve in, from his perspective. And so you can imagine his calculations are different personally. Because what's quite interesting about all of this, and I find this the most fascinating when we talk about these things, Joel, is that when you look from the outside, I think there's a tendency to think there is a game of 4D chess going on.
4D, not just 3D.
4D chess.
4D chess.
But Netanyahu and Gallant are just like you and I. They're men that sit in a room and make decisions based off what they think is best for the strategy that they have in their mind. And that's how they've conducted this war. It's how they have conducted the conversations behind the scenes about a possible ceasefire. And just recently, we were able to confirm a report that first came out in Axios that is true, that in recent weeks, there have been screaming matches between the prime minister and the defense minister over what to do about a ceasefire. But it gives you a sense of how tense things are in those rooms, because they're taking what's coming from the negotiating table and making difficult decisions about how to continue the conflict.
And this is a huge issue because it is so emotionally divided here in Israel. Everybody wants all the hostages back, but most people also say, I mean, the polls show it's a divide, but most Israelis say yes, but not at the risk of surrendering to Hamas, at the risk that they're going to emerge as, okay, we survived and now we're still running Gaza. And I think Netanyahu saying the Philadelphia corridor, that narrow strip right between Gaza's southernmost city, Rafah, and the Egyptian border, where all those tunnels were. You know, Israel discovered so many of them where weapons, rockets, ammunition, all kinds of supplies were coming in. Netanyahu says we absolutely have to hold it. And if we walk away even for a few weeks, Hamas could resupply. Gallant is saying, first of all, we're crushing Hamas. We can give up this for a few weeks. They can't resupply to the extent that that we can't handle it. And then we can move back right in, but let's get these hostages out. There's almost none left that are alive. That shouting match you described, talk about it a little bit more, because this is a cabinet meeting that, first of all, nobody's supposed to be leaking, but there's a lot of leaks coming out because there are two titanic forces in that room saying, I absolutely disagree with you. And these are friends and allies. This is not on left-right. This is not Biden versus Trump.
Yeah. Right. And look, I've reported from the Philadelphia corridor earlier this year. We were with Israeli forces as they drove us into Rafah, Gaza's southernmost city. The bottom line here is that that corridor, that really is just about the width of a football field, had been used traditionally for smuggling everything from weapons to Kentucky Fried Chicken. You can go to Google and you can look that up now. There's smugglers in the tunnels beneath Gaza holding Kentucky Fried Chicken. And there's an interesting article you can find online of how they would take it from Egypt. It was very expensive. And I once asked a senior official about this. A senior Hamas official about the smuggling corridor in this story about Kentucky Fried Chicken. And he joked to me and he said, you know, Trey, the worst part was the fries were always cold.
Gosh.
But when you step back from this and you think about that corridor, it had been used traditionally for the smuggling of weapons components, of people, and a variety of other things. But the Israelis currently control it, and they've destroyed the majority of the tunnels that exist there. And so even if they give up the Philadelphia corridor for weeks or months or even years, it will take a long time without anyone in the Philadelphia corridor or monitoring it. It would take a long time to rebuild those tunnels. But that's not the case. People will be monitoring it. The whole world's attention is on this area, and the Israelis will understandably want to know what's coming in and out of Gaza. And so this idea that they would suddenly be able to re-smuggle weapons in, I think as a journalist, the question I ask is two things. Well, how quickly do you believe that could happen? And where would those weapons come from? Because when you look at the other side of the border, it's no man's land. Yeah. It is the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt.
And Egypt is on high alert now. Something went wrong. That's a different topic for another day. They allowed this, or they turned a blind eye to it, or there was corruption and graft. There's a lot of questions there. But now the entire world, certainly the U.S., CIA, and others are watching and making sure that the Egyptians don't allow weapons to come through there. But this goes back to this titanic clash between a prime minister and a defense minister of the same team, and it's causing a huge social divide here that's very, very painful. Because if Gallant is right, that militarily Israel doesn't need that for 6 weeks or whatever it's going to be, so we can get live hostages out, then many Israelis feel like it would be immoral not to go make the deal. Even if it's a flawed deal, at least these people get out before. But the prime minister is saying, no, you absolutely can't. This is a surrender. It's been reported originally by the Wall Street Journal, now by others, that within days of the October 7th invasion in the south, but also the Hezbollah launch of massive amounts of mortars and rockets and missiles on October 8th, that Yoav Gollant, as the defense minister, advised the prime minister and the war cabinet, we need to do a massive and preemptive attack on Hezbollah launching pads and missile sites immediately. U.S. intelligence picked up on the preparations that Israeli defense forces were making to do it. President Joe Biden calls Netanyahu, and in a long and intense call says, absolutely not, I will absolutely not support Israel doing this. There are going to be implications, repercussions if you do this. Stay focused on the south. Don't open up a new front in the north. This, Netanyahu wins this argument by saying we're going to not have the support of the president of the United States, which is a big issue. What can you tell us about that clash?
It was a major clash, and it took place in the first week of the war. And the Israelis had prepared to strike Hezbollah, Iran's largest proxy in the region, that has an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles, all aimed at Israel. And as I reported this story out, confirming some of the other reporting that you've talked about, I went to Gallant and I asked him about this, and he declined to go on the record about the details of that night. But I was able to gather information from other sources in the region, and of course these other reports. And I can tell you that Israeli jets were in the sky. They were prepared to strike Hezbollah in southern Lebanon in a wide-scale attack to stop the group from being involved in this war. And at the very last minute, President Biden called Prime Minister Netanyahu and told him to call off the attack. And this changed the course of the war, because as we know, just 24 hours after Hamas invaded Israel, Hezbollah got directly involved in the fight. And since then, they have launched thousands of rockets, mortars, and drones into northern Israel. They've targeted communities along the border with anti-tank guided missiles. This has forced the evacuation of nearly 100,000 Israeli civilians who are still displaced from their homes.
After a year.
After a year. And it's remarkable.
With no end in sight.
No end in sight, because there are lower level negotiations with Amos Hochstein, President Biden's advisor, ongoing behind the scenes, but there is no indication there will be a parallel deal with Lebanon to de-escalate the tension there. And as we saw in recent weeks, the Israelis are still continuing daily airstrikes. They took preemptive action against Hezbollah to target the rocket launching positions of what I'm told from defense sources are 6,000 different rockets and missiles that were prepared to be launched.
That was a huge success. And I will say the IDF has racked up some major successes, not just the IDF, but Mossad, the assassination of the head of Hamas, the military chief of Hamas in Gaza, Mohammed Deif, and the number two, which is really essentially the military chief of staff of Hezbollah in Beirut. Those were huge successes. And then, of course, the rescue of an Israeli hostage out of Gaza, an Israeli Muslim, Arab, Bedouin hostage, and then, as you say, preempting the launch of upwards of 6,000 missiles at Israel. These have been big successes, but the murder of 6 Israelis, the execution of 6 Israeli hostages has taken us from, wow, we're turning the tide, that feeling of things are getting better, to absolute despondency in Israel, and now new intense clashes. Let's wrap up. Where does this go?
The worst case scenario is a broader regional war where Israel faces direct attacks from Iran, attacks from its proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Iran-backed Iraqi and Syrian Shia militias, and other threats from Gaza and the West Bank. The real question, though, is if diplomatic efforts can succeed. There's a possibility that there will be a ceasefire with Gaza. It will allow the entire region to take an exit ramp. But as things stand today, it appears things will get worse before they get better.
You're doing a great job.
Joel, thank you.
Praying for your safety.
Thank you.
Thank you for making your first interview here on the Rosenberg Report. We appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for watching. You have to pick up a copy of Black Saturday for yourself. You need to pick up a copy as a gift for family and friends because it's critical that American Christians, as well as all Americans and others around the world, still understand what happened on October 7th. It's not just what's happening now, although obviously that's huge. And Trey is covering it. The Rosenberg Report is covering it. We're covering it at all Israel News and all Arab News, and we should. It's an ongoing, very intense, very important story. But it all started with a specific strategy on a specific day. And Black Saturday is literally the only book in English by a reporter. There's only 3 books in English at all about what happened. And this is the only one by an American journalist. And I'm so grateful to have Trey Yingst on for last week and this. Please share a link to this show on your social media with family and friends. You can find the link at rosenbergreport.tv and of course on our YouTube channel, which I encourage you to subscribe to both because I want you to keep educating and mobilizing your family and friends to understand what's happening and to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to pray that God would supernaturally heal and comfort Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese, and others who are so devastated and so traumatized by this war, a war that at this point seemed to have no end in sight. Let's pray for peace, pray for security, pray for an end to this nightmare. We're not there yet. May God give you and your family a peaceful and relaxed week. Wherever you are, whatever you're dealing with, as you walk with Jesus, as you spend time in His Word, as you spend time in prayer and worship, walking in the power of the Holy Spirit, may He give you a peace that passes all understanding. And Lord willing, I'll see you next week right here on the Rosenberg Report. Again, thank you. This was an amazing interview.